Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today, Mr. John Gunnison and myself are back at it again with a show on the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas stemming out of the events from October 7th. And we do have a truly distinguished guest joining us to discuss and understand these issues, hopefully a little bit better. He is Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on UN foreign policy. He has written 5 books, including his most recent, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President, and importantly, served for 25 years as a State Department analyst, advisor, and negotiator to secretaries of states from both political parties, Republicans and Democrats. So, Aaron, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come and spend some time with us.
No, it's great to be here with you and Justin, with you and John.
Before we get going, I just wanted to ask you to help us understand the events of October 7th from your perspective, your wealth of experience. Because when this just happened, my initial thought was this is extremely sad, and I just got filled with dread and didn't understand any of the larger ramifications. So I was hoping that you could walk us through your analysis of the event and maybe some of the longer lasting impacts that will be felt by Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah, the last 4 weeks have been obviously devastating for Israelis and Palestinians. I've really kept my eye on three crucial sorts of points that have helped me navigate, even for me, what has been an extremely frustrating and dark period. And I think it's important to make these points for anyone who's seriously interested in trying to understand a crisis that has more moving parts and has more opacity, very difficult to understand and to get information on the key aspects. So the first point I would make is the need for humility. There are so many dimensions in this crisis about which we know very little. We know nothing about the state or fate of the hostages, 241 humans, whom Hamas, maybe Palestine Islamic Jihad, and if the reports are true, individual Palestinians or families actually hold hostages as well. We know almost nothing about the Israeli ground campaign. The Israelis control the information space. They talk about what their objectives are, but we have no sense of their timeline or even the granularity of some of their tactics. They've allowed foreign journalists, their own journalists, to go into Gaza with them, but they're under very serious constraints. We also know very little about the situation building along the Israeli-Lebanese border. We think we have a good sense that neither Hezbollah or Iran wants a confrontation with the Israelis, because with 2 carrier strike groups in the Eastern Med, 200 strike aircraft, a Marine expeditionary unit, 2,000 Marines, sailors, and Marines, and a nuclear-powered sub, the administration has clearly spent a lot of time on the issue of deterrence. And so far, after a month and 2 days, it appears to be working. And we know nothing, of course, about the proverbial day after and where this might be headed. So that's the first point. Humility is critically important. Speculation is rampant. It's dangerous. Analysis needs to be tethered to facts and data. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of either. Second is the issue of humanity. October 7 reached a new level of savagery and brutality that we have not seen in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It may be comparable to what the Phalange did in Beirut, Sabra and Shatila, but nothing we've seen, not even the terror, the suicide bombings of the Second Intifada, approached the level of intimate savagery and brutality that occurred in the space of those 24 hours, when 20 communities in the so-called Gaza envelope were exposed to anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 Hamas gunmen who came with clear instructions to inflict as much pain and as much indiscriminate death as they possibly could. I strongly believe, watching events play out in the wake of October 7, that we need to keep our hearts and minds open to the grievous suffering, humanitarian catastrophe, the exponential number of Palestinian deaths that have occurred, as a consequence of Israel's efforts to strike and eradicate Hamas as a military organization. Tony Blinken is right. In war, there is no hierarchy when it comes to civilians. An Israeli life is worth no more, no less than a Palestinian. And finally, a comment on hope and history. I was in Jerusalem on October 6, 1973. I listened to the sirens wail. I watched a society shocked and traumatized by the October 1973 war until these events here, the greatest intelligence failure in the history of the state of Israel. And yet, within 6 years of that trauma, I watched Sadat and Begin and Jimmy Carter on the White House lawn sign a Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. So in that case, trauma turned to hope. 20 years later, I sat again on the White House lawn, watching President Clinton preside over a signing ceremony between Arafat and the late Prime Minister Rabin, the Oslo Accords, thinking wrongly that we had reached a point of no return in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it was only a matter of time before, with all kinds of ups and downs, that these two peoples would find a pathway forward. And yet, in that instance, hope turned to trauma. So, what do you make of all this? In the first instance, trauma to hope. The second, hope to trauma. What it tells me is that the arc of history bends in very unpredictable ways. We cannot see what's in front of us. Every breakthrough in the Arab-Israeli conflict, without exception, that occurred in the conflict zone. The Abraham Accords did not occur in a conflict zone. They were governed by a separate set of arrangements which lacked the trauma, the brutality, the violence, the death, the killing, and the historical wounding of an Israeli-Jordanian war, of an Israeli-Palestinian war, and certainly of an Israeli-Egyptian war. So could it be, even though we're in a very long, dark tunnel, that events here could somehow compel Israelis and Palestinians to find a better way? I don't know. But what I do know and what I firmly believe is it really is up to humans, us, to bend the historical arc in as positive a direction as we can. It's hard to maintain a sense of hope amidst all of these horrors of the past 4 weeks. But frankly, I don't see the alternative. To surrender to despair essentially means more of the same. And I'm not willing to accept that. The Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, did not begin on October 7th. But the level of violence, brutality, savagery, the indiscriminate, willful, intentional murder of mostly Israeli men, women, and children, and the attack on the Nova Rave in Kibbutz Be'eri, which, by the way, surpassed the attack on the Bataclan in Paris 2016 by ISIS-inspired gunmen. 130 people were killed there. The rave claimed 260 lives. That level of intimate brutality and the delight, I haven't seen the footage from the body cams, the head cams that the Israelis have now shown to foreign journalists there, and my understanding at the Israeli embassy, they showed to American journalists. But it created a new frame. Mike Herzog, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., said on October 6th, Israel was one country. On October 8th, Israel was another country. I would take that to heart because I think in comparisons to 9/11 just are wrong. We didn't have a proximity problem with al-Qaeda. Afghanistan was thousands of miles away. Israel has a proximity problem of closeness with Hamas and with any hope of finding a equitable and durable solution with Palestinians. And the events of October 7th, I think, has so traumatized Israelis that it's created a whole new set of horrors, which will impact the way Israelis look at negotiations, look at a Palestinian Authority, look at Palestinians with guns, Palestinian security services. And it brings to mind, and if you marry that with the Israeli response, the blockade, the humanitarian catastrophe, the punishing airstrikes, the Israelis have conducted airstrikes which, if you believe the military analysts, are the most intense airstrikes of the 21st century. The most intense airstrikes of the 21st century. I don't know how reliable the numbers are. The president took issue with the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health. 10,000 plus. What if it's just 8,000 or 7,500? A whole new generation has been traumatized. And the notion that Israelis and Palestinians don't understand one another, back on the proximity trope. For both peoples, I think the problem is they don't, in view of what's happened to both sides, they understand each other only too well. And the conclusions they're taking away are really not hopeful. One last point. The motives behind this attack are, I think, stunning in their simplicity. People ask all the time, why did Hamas do this? And I think the answer lies in the nature of the organization and its ideology. This was not about reclaiming territory. This was not about breaking out of Gaza, an open-air prison. There probably was some of that. This is not about an effort to inflict a measure of pain on the Israelis that would somehow compel them to settle with the Palestinians. That's not Hamas's objective. It's not the organization. Hamas is the embodiment of an idea. It's an organizational embodiment of an idea, which is the Islamist trend within the Palestinian national movement. If tomorrow Netanyahu stood up and said, here's your Palestinian state, all of the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas would not agree. Or if they agreed, it would be part of the approach of Marhalia, the liberation of Palestine in stages. Hamas wants an Islamic state in Palestine. And Palestine as a God-sanctioned waqf is not up for negotiation or division. And I think the purpose of this attack was to demonstrate with a terrifying clarity that the Palestinian issue is central to the struggle, not so that we could resolve the Palestinian issue, but that we could continue the struggle. Don't think you can end run with Israeli-Saudi normalization. This is part of a long, hard, and bitter struggle to regain all of Palestine. And if we, Hamas, played a role in this by shocking the world, and this was about blood, by the way, not the taking of land.
Today marks 1 month since Hamas terrorists launched a bloody and deadly attack in Israel, killing 1,400 people and sparking a war between Israel and Hamas. In the aftermath, Gaza's health ministry, which is run by Hamas, says more than 10,000 people have died on its side of the border since the war began. Now, Israeli ground troops are inside Gaza and say they are tightening their grip on Gaza City.
I think you just so eloquently outlined the motivations behind the attacks on October 7th. But before that, how truly gruesome and foundation shaking they were for many, all people living in Israel. And then you touched on the response from the Israeli government, the most intense airstrikes that the 21st century has seen, according to some military experts. So that leads us to try and understand the Israeli response, which you also said we don't know much about. So from what we do know, the media reports, we've seen, bombings, and now there's some ground troops in Gaza. From what we do know, and from your understanding, your experience, how much of this response is driven by tactical objectives that fit into an overarching strategy versus, I don't know if retribution is the right term, but versus a more forceful response that helps to reinstall a feeling of security among the people of Israel, or just anger?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I'm not sure. It may be a blend of both. The IDF, Mossad, Shin Bet, all were responsible for the strategic intelligence failure and the operational failure. With the exception of the prime minister, most of the heads of these agencies have already accepted full responsibility. And there will be a state commission of inquiry. The response strategically, is there a commitment to the dead, to the 1,400? Yes. Is vengeance part of the notion of preempting and preventing this thing from ever happening again? I would think so. Have the Israelis expanded their rules of engagement, or are they willfully ignoring the international humanitarian law and the laws of war? The administration is talking to them about changing their ordinance, not dropping 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs, but going to smaller diameter bombs, particularly in densely populated areas. Eradication of Hamas as a military organization, ending its sovereignty in Gaza, its administrative capacity to govern. I think the Israelis concede the fact that they cannot eliminate Hamas as an ideology. The strategy in Gaza City is to clear, hold, and perhaps build, although from my understanding, most of the engagement, however fierce, has not contained large numbers of Israelis engaging with Hamas fighters. These are pop-ups, maybe taking advantage of tunnel entrances and exits. The Israelis, I think, they say that they've capped or destroyed 130 tunnels. I mean, what the Israelis refer to as the Gaza Metro, 300 miles reportedly, which is half the length of the subway system of New York City. It's a lot of tunnels. Maybe they can block the ventilation ducts. And of course, they, I think, are persuaded that through military pressure, they can, and perhaps operational intelligence, they'd have a better chance of trying to determine where the hostages are and maybe how they can rescue or redeem them. So I can't answer the question of which phase are we in and where are they going next. They've divided Gaza into two. They clearly, the bulk of their forces have not yet been committed. I've heard numbers, 20,000 Israelis deployed. That may be high, that may be low. It's going to take far more than that if they're going to literally seal Gaza City, to ensure that no Hamas leaders escape. And then, of course, there's the issue of the tunnel structure. So frankly, I don't think we know. I interviewed General Petraeus on Tuesday, and I pressed him on his experiences in Fallujah. Fallujah was a fifth the size of Gaza. In 5 days, there was no organized resistance left. 75 Marines were killed, 600 wounded, and they killed 2,200 operatives. But in 5 days, most of the resistance was over. I mean, we're 32 days into this, and it could go weeks, if not longer. So I think that, frankly, transition to the Biden administration is part of the problem, because the Israeli operational clock against Hamas is ticking very slowly. And Biden's political clock, pressured by his own party, by the region, key Arab states, and by the international community, is ticking very fast.
Aaron, I've got a question for you so that we can better understand what Israel's goals here are. We're talking about how their primary goal is to eliminate the leadership of Hamas, take out the leadership of Hamas. You mentioned that it's difficult to really destroy Hamas as an ideology, but they aspire to take out the leaders, the people who plan the attack, and so on. I think there's been a little bit of confusion because several of the political leaders of Hamas are living outside of the Gaza Strip. Ismail Haniyeh is probably the most prominent, who's described often as the leader of Hamas. And he travels freely between Doha and Qatar and Turkey, elsewhere around the region. There doesn't seem to be an effort to arrest him, apprehend him. It's leading me to question to what extent he is even really the de facto leader of Hamas, and to what extent he was even involved or aware of the military planning of this attack. Can you help us understand a little bit who actually leads Hamas, where are they, and how these different characters are being treated in this effort to take out the leadership of the organization?
The two individuals the Israelis want the most are Mohammed Deif and Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar was born in Khan Yunis, as was, I think, Deif. Sinwar was serving a long prison sentence for killing 4 Palestinian collaborators who were working with the Israeli intelligence. And Sinwar was traded in the Shalit deal. He was one of the 1,079 Palestinian prisoners that the Israelis let out in exchange for the Gilad Shalit in 2011. Those are the premium targets on Israel's list. I can't imagine that the external leadership, particularly Hania and Khalid Meshal, I mean, they're marked humans. And I think that at some point, just as the Israelis operated after Black September at the Munich Olympics in 1972, that there'll be a reckoning there as well. I'm told there are 200 names on the list, both planners and attackers on October 7. We don't know whether Hania or Khalid Meshal knew anything about this. Maybe the planning, but not the timing. And again, Hamas is a military organization which has a pretty sophisticated infrastructure. They clearly have held rockets in reserve to demonstrate that far into this conflict, in a month or so, they'll still have the capacity to use these rockets against the Israelis. They're saving them. And these rocket labs, the ammunition dumps, the command and control, the intelligence headquarters, all of this stuff can be destroyed and leaders can be killed.
So, Aaron, as we're talking about Israel's goals of taking out the leadership of Hamas, of course, Hamas are the entity that have governed the Gaza Strip since at least 2006. And as we're also questioning the medium to long-term strategy here from the Israelis, there's the obvious question, who is going to govern the Gaza Strip when this is at least somewhat settled down? Do the Israelis have an idea of who's going to be responsible for the Gaza Strip?
I think, possession is 9/10 of the law. The Israelis will be in Gaza for many months to come. Even if they succeed, or if they don't, it's preventing Hamas's resurgence over time. I mean, they estimate 2.3 million people, you need 10,000 peacekeepers. So you can look at the options. Revitalizing the Palestinian Authority, maybe. Some sort of UN trusteeship, probably not. Kosovo could provide a model. They created a multinational security force, but that would require a UN Security Council mandate, and the Russians and the Chinese probably aren't eager to support anything that's smacked of an American, with an American imprimatur. Egypt ruled Gaza from 48 to 67. It has its own security and economic interests. I find the idea of an Arab force patrolling the streets of Gaza and running a counterinsurgency against Palestinians, residual elements from Hamas or other Islamic, the Iranians will be pouring money in an effort to organize a resistance in Gaza. They actually are the greatest proponents of Greater Israel, both on the West Bank and in Gaza. Iran would like nothing better than to see Israel stay in these places because it weakens the Israelis. So, no, I think the proverbial day after, I think we need to get rid of that expression. It's not the day after. There's no bright line between Israeli military operations that will end, and then you're going to move into a period of reconstruction. Plus, you have at least, 10,000 administrative functionaries, some paid by the Palestinian Authority, others by the Qataris with that Israeli acquiescence. Some of those people are Hamas advocates, some are not. There was an interesting poll done October 6th, 790 respondents. Who would you like to see president of the Palestinian Authority? Abbas got 12%. Hania got 24%. And Marwan Barghouti, who's currently serving 5 lifetime sentences in an Israeli prison, he did the best. So the vast majority of people in Gaza, I would argue, are disappointed and frustrated with Hamas's governance. How the impact of what is being visited on them during the last month is going to play is anyone's guess. But you're going to need a process of legitimization. And the only way to do that is through elections. Elections for a Palestinian president, elections for a Palestinian legislative council. Last time they were held in 2006, before Hamas launched its coup the next year against Fatah. Hamas did extremely well. Could they do well again, given the corruption of the Fatah-controlled Palestinian Authority? Abbas is 87 in the 18th year of a 4-year term. He has no credibility on the streets, none. He can't protect his people from Israeli soldiers or settlers. He controls 40% of the West Bank, if he's lucky. So how you move these pieces around is anybody's guess. And I think, even though I doubt whether the administration has many more good ideas, and Petraeus made it clear that Israel had a working group, you seem to be familiar with it, that were actually trying to sort this out. But so much is going to depend on how the Israelis succeed, can they succeed, and at what cost. I think one of the reasons we have very little leverage with the Israelis is because we have no better idea. We have no idea how to rescue the hostages, get them all out. And Hamas, as you know, is playing games, letting maybe, if this impending deal works, 10 to 15 hostages out, few Israeli women and children, and other foreign nationals. They can drag this out for quite some time. We have no better ideas on how to get the hostages out. We have no better ideas how they can prosecute their war without killing thousands of Palestinian civilians. And we have no better idea, frankly, on what is going to emerge in the proverbial day after. You combine that with Biden's preternatural support, emotional support for the pictures he saw in the wake of October 7, and the domestic politics at home, in which you have a Republican Party, which is the Israel can do no wrong party, and a Democratic Party that's divided between a majority of traditional Democrats beginning to ask tougher questions of Israel, and the rise of smaller number of progressives who are very vocal and want Biden to impose consequences on the Israelis if they don't agree to a ceasefire. So all of this stuff is swirling around, and the administration, even though they've changed the frame, filling it in with two-state solution, Secretary had a nice, what I describe as the 5 no's yesterday: no territorial aggrandizement, no forced displacement of Palestinians, no long-term occupation. He's trying to fill in the frame and be more sensitive to Palestinian needs and requirements. But it still is evident to anyone who wants to look at this objectively that we are still in Israel's corner.
I have to say my great-grandmother fled the Armenian genocide, so I am a little bit personally invested in that. I think that morally there should be a Jewish state, just based on my family's experiences of being hunted, around the world for a while. But that makes this question tough to ask, because in the news we are seeing stories, obviously colored by the fog of war, where Israel will bomb allegedly a refugee camp, and we will hear some type of opaque military reasoning for it. But that brings up concerns of grave war crimes potentially being committed. From your perspective, having been inside administrations, is there a point when a red line becomes evident where it's time for the Biden administration to step up, whether it be publicly or behind closed doors, to push back on Netanyahu and Israel's response?
Well, 4 weeks. In 4 weeks, you've seen very little pushback. we may be second guessing Israeli tactics, but we're not pushing them to agree to anything more than when the president wanted a several week pause. And he said today that he wanted something even longer than that. On war crimes, I think that what we know clearly, well, the ICC will make a judgment, presumably. They have already have a mandate to investigate their own view that since 2014, both Israelis and Palestinians have committed what they consider to be war crimes. The administration is not going to weigh in on that matter. They put themselves front and center when it came to Vladimir Putin. And many people make the argument that what's the difference between Russia's occupation of the Donbass and Israel's occupation of the West Bank? Well, we could spend the next 30 minutes unwinding why a brutal naked war of aggression against Crimea and the forcible abduction of hundreds of children and the sort of intimate brutality of executing Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, not to mention the other atrocities in a place like Bucha. That's not the context of the environment in which the Israelis are operating. Vladimir Putin uses his cruise missiles, and it's going to be a very cruel winter for Ukraine, to willfully target civilian areas, not because they're co-located with Ukrainian military assets, because it's a terror campaign. You turn the lights out, you make people freeze, you hit the grids. I mean, a lot of people will basically say, but that's essentially what Israel's doing. It's an occupier, it's an aggressor, it's a colonial settler state. The real question, I think, is this. And again, I'm not an international lawyer. Are the Israelis abiding by the two basic principles of adherence to international humanitarian law and the laws of war? Distinction and proportionality. Distinction and proportionality. I'm sure, given the number of casualties, that they probably aren't.
You know, when I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning, I told him the United States stands with the people of Israel in the face of these terrorist assaults. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks. And my administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering. Let me say this as clearly as I can. This is not a moment for any party hostile to Israel to exploit these attacks to seek advantage. The world is watching.
Aaron, that brings, I think, the Biden administration approach into question, because there is so much criticism about Israel's quite aggressive campaign in Gaza. And the assessment that you've described is an assessment shared by many people around the world, that the Israelis are not adhering, at least to the principles of proportionality and distinction. The strategy, I think you described it pretty well. It's been described elsewhere as the bear hug, the idea of coming as close as possible publicly to the Israelis in the aftermath of these devastating attacks on October 7th, hopefully to give the administration a bit of leverage in internal discussions with the Israeli leadership. And you've already described some of the reasons why the U.S. capacity in that regard is a little bit limited, because the U.S. might not have any better ideas about how to fight the war and so on. But I want to ask you whether you think that trade-off is worth it when we think about the regional and the global perspective on how the U.S. is approaching this. Have we, as the U.S., gained enough ability to shape actions inside of the Israeli leadership right now that it's worth some of the blowback that we're getting from outside of Israel?
I don't think the administration, for any number of the reasons I identified, will come to a tipping point in which Biden will pick up the phone and say to Netanyahu, enough. It's hard for me to see that happening, largely because of what happened on October 7 and the hostages, which is a daily reminder of the cruelty and brutality of Hamas, right? So I could see a situation emerging in which, not intentionally, but still as a consequence of an Israeli action, some mass casualty event occurred. Israelis are citing the Brits bombing of Copenhagen in 1944. They went after Gestapo headquarters. They had a children's hospital. 84 kids were killed. In Mosul in 2017, and in several airstrikes, we killed 100 civilians, not to mention the fire bombings of Dresden and Tokyo. So what's the moral calculation here? And what's the political calculation of telling the Israelis, demanding that they agree to a ceasefire? I would ask the question, form follows function. So what would be the purpose telling the Israelis they have to stop? And indirect negotiations would begin through the Qataris or the Egyptians for some arrangement that would bring hostilities in Gaza to an end. Another PLO extraction, 82, the entire PLO leadership plus 2,500 fighters under American auspices are extracted from Beirut. Is that an option? Would the Israelis agree? We free all the hostages, we lay down all of our arms, and we get a free ride. We get safe passage out of Gaza. It's hard for me to believe that the Israelis would buy that, but they could, arguing that at some point they'll get all these guys, just like they did in the wake of Munich. Again, you'd really have to identify for the president a compelling reason as to why he should not just tell the Israelis to stop, but hand Hamas a critically important victory. All they need to do is to survive. So what is the compelling reason?
Domestic politics?
You mean the president's going to lose the state of Michigan? No administration I ever worked for elevated human rights to a critically important issue in the agenda. Responsibility to protect, with the exception of Kosovo, Nazi Holocaust, Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, Syria. We've never interceded to stop genocide, with the exception of Bosnia and maybe the bombing campaign in Kosovo. So what are we trying to do? In other words, what is the point? The point is to stop the killing of innocents and to improve America's moral what? We lead not by the example of our power, but by, the president is fond of saying, by the power of our example. I mean, after 10,000 Palestinians, and what if the number goes to 15,000 or 20,000? The most compelling reason is to stop the killing, to save innocent human lives, men, women, and children. That is the moral argument. And then you need to figure out how to deal with the consequences of the ceasefire. If you ask me, do I think the president of the United States would get on the phone and say this to Netanyahu, this is intolerable, too many people have died, let's say in the wake of a mass casualty event because an errant Israeli missile strikes a concentration of Palestinian refugees, like that happened in Qana in 1996, when an errant Israeli missile incinerated 100 plus Palestinians in Lebanon and Lebanese in Qana. 100 people were killed by a couple errant Israeli artillery shells. In the wake of that, the president picks up the phone and says it has to stop. And what that means is, it stops because we are going to create some pathway out of this problem where you don't have to use military force anymore. We're going to have Hamas disarmed. We're going to give it safe passage out of Gaza. I mean, this is where it gets. I mean, you got to come up with answers. It's got to be more than virtue signaling. I don't argue with the moral force of stopping innocent humans from being killed. Question is whether the administration, in supporting a ceasefire, because it has refused humanitarian pauses for sure, 4 days, 2 weeks, but a ceasefire, an indirectly negotiated ceasefire, what is the point of the ceasefire?
For all the reasons that you're describing, the U.S. have a limited capacity and a limited interest, perhaps, in shaping the Israeli approach here. I want to ask about the extent to which the U.S. has shaped the actions of other actors here. And you've already addressed this a little bit in this conversation, talking about the deployment of the aircraft carrier and other military actions that the U.S. has taken to deter actors like Hezbollah and Iran. I'm curious, as a U.S. advisor, policymaker, someone involved in the U.S. policy process, whether we can perhaps credit U.S. policy in this regard. I'm interested if this, in your view, is decisive. What's the counterfactual? If the U.S. had not taken these steps, do you think that Hezbollah and other actors might have taken on a very different role in this conflict?
I think the bottom line is that neither Iran nor Hezbollah was interested in a major confrontation with Israel. Hezbollah repository of high trajectory weapons, numbering anywhere from 150 to 200,000, is a huge strategic asset to be deployed, I think, in only one circumstance, and that is an Israeli and American attack on Iran to destroy its conventional, unconventional military cells. I don't think Hassan Nasrallah, he's prepared to fight Israel to the last Palestinian. And over the last 3 weeks, they're engaging according to the rules of the game. They're not shelling deep into Israeli territory. So far, if there were no carrier strike groups, would they be more risk ready? Probably. And the backdoor into escalation is a pro-Iranian militia in Iraq and Syria finally getting lucky and killing 15 Americans. If that happens, I could easily see an escalation. The administration would be under huge pressure to respond, and not just against targets in Iraq and Syria. So you could get a backdoor escalation that way. I think without the show of deterrence, Hezbollah would have probably been more risk ready, but still not willing to expend these valuable resources. Remember, they are looking at Gaza, and they, like the rest of us, don't really know what the outcome is. Hamas may well survive. The Israelis may conclude a month from now or 6 weeks from now that they simply can't find and kill or capture the Hamas leadership. We haven't even seen the kinds of engagements yet. I think 30, 40 Israeli soldiers have died in the ground campaign so far. It's largely because most of the heavy engagements in the tunnel structures, I don't think, have started. Maybe they're going to starve them out. Maybe the issue is siege. You empty Gaza City, which is happening. I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of half the population of Gaza is displaced. So I think Hezbollah is calibrating their moves. They're also under pressure from the Lebanese political system to spare Lebanon, because if in fact they get into it, it's Lebanese infrastructure that's going to be attacked by Israel.
On October 7th. Now, there are diplomatic efforts underway. The U.S. Has sent Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the region several times. He's been consulting with the Israelis. He's been consulting with Arab partners as well. But those efforts do not seem to be making any progress right now. Right now, the focus is just on pauses in the fighting, humanitarian aid, and none of the big issues that really have to be looked at. Israel is pressing ahead. It is resisting any calls for a ceasefire. So fighting will continue for some time. And the bigger questions, when will the fighting end? And what happens to Gaza and what happens to the people of Gaza when this fighting ends remain big questions and unanswered for the time being.
I guess this is the concluding question of our discussion. Without predicting the future, what is a potential way that it resolves itself, becomes resolved, and is there any hopeful signs that we should look for that we might be close to an end?
Well, an end of the active military confrontation or an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The president said something, I'm writing on this for foreign policy. The president said something a week ago, which is truly stunning in its brevity and its scope. He said, we cannot go back to the status quo before October 6th. I'm not sure he understood the full import of what he was saying. Because what that means is, not only do you need a new reality in Gaza, but you have to tether Gaza to a serious effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Otherwise, you're not going to get a Palestinian interlocutor to deal with Gaza. Abbas won't do it. He'll be seen as what? America's policeman? Israel's policeman? So, no, I mean, if Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, were here reading the best of Golden Trails, she could not answer your question. She just couldn't. And I'm loath to. I mentioned humility. I think it's early days. I think this is going to go on for weeks, unless the Israelis actually do end up finding hostages and they free them. Or they end up killing the 2 or 3 top leaders. Some significant gain that allows the Israelis to pause. But other than that, I mean, it's, next month we're going to be having the same conversation.
Extremely disheartening and sad. So, do you have any last thoughts you would like to leave the audience with?
I still remain hopeful, despite it all. Largely because Israelis and Palestinians aren't going anywhere, because the proximity problem, as raw as it is right now, guarantees no status quo, and because there's no military solution to this problem. What is missing, and what neither side has, is leadership. If you had leadership and effective mediation from the outside, you could begin, I think, slowly and carefully to structure a different sort of pathway out of this. And this October 7 and the dangers of proximity to both peoples means that separation through negotiation is the only solution to this conflict. Anybody who would even begin to argue that this conflict has somehow reaffirmed the importance of Israelis and Palestinians all existing under one big happy roof and living happily ever after needs to really rethink all this talk about one state extending rights to Israelis and Palestinians. After this, they're going to want a divorce through negotiation, and over time, coming together in cooperative arrangements which deal with the proximity problem, the security implications of the proximity problem, the economic implications of the security problem, and the psychology. And let's not forget about Jerusalem, which, by the way, I hate even to say it because I don't want to jinx it. Hamas termed this operation the Al-Aqsa Flood, and yet Jerusalem has remained preternaturally quiet during this. I'm not sure I understand why.
And just as we're closing here, since you mentioned the problems of leadership, very quickly, will Netanyahu go down as the worst ever?
1.8 years is the average length of an Israeli government since independence. There'll be a state commission of inquiry. He presided over the greatest terror attack in the history of the state of Israel, the bloodiest day for Jews since the end of the Nazi Holocaust, the largest intelligence failure. And I think next year at this time.
Yeah.
I think you'll see a different political reality in Israel.